This is the first lecture on Chapter 2, talking about research. The idea about research, of course, has to do with being able to produce data that will help to understand better sociology in particular, but any kind of phenomena in general. Different methods of research exist, different kinds of approaches. There's an opening anecdote about a researcher who goes to a particular complex to speak with the people who live there and to conduct a survey. The difficulty lies in the fact that after a period of time, the researcher finds that there's less of a matter of trying to complete the survey and more of an interest in interacting directly with the people who live there. The problem then starts to arise that the researcher has lost a certain perspective on being able to do things. The example that opens the chapter may be a bit on the extreme side, that you see a researcher who so identifies with subjects as to become part of the phenomena that the researcher wants to study. However, I think the point to the anecdote is to suggest that there's ways in which in the research process perspective can get lost. And so think of it as a cautionary tale about how to go about conducting research. Let me add, by the way, that for those of you who are taking this course as sociology majors, the whole topic of research is something that is the subject of a class in its own right, one of the two classes that you need to take towards your junior or senior years. It's also a class that is required of other majors. I know that it would be for psychology and criminal justice. With research, part of the critical aspect of it is the rules that are followed, if you will, research methods. So the idea behind it is that you're hoping to gather information. One way in which you can distinguish information is to characterize it as qualitative or quantitative. Qualitative may be more subjective in nature, but nonetheless may be valuable. So a researcher who perhaps goes and watches the patrons in a bar one night may be recording his or her experiences in the observing of the actions of the patrons. That's qualitative research. Quantitative, on the other hand, has as a virtue the fact that you can both measure it, and since it's reducible to numeric form, you may be able to do certain kinds of calculations with it. Those calculations in turn may end up being able to establish more about the nature of the data. To suggest that data is one or the other is not to imply that one is necessarily better than the other. In fact, it just depends on what you want to measure, what you're interested in measuring. When it comes to conducting research, the author suggests that there's two basic approaches, deductive and inductive. Inductive may be easier to define because it talks about making observations and then from those observations coming up with a theory. A theory tends to be an explanation. So if it works well, you can see it explaining current conditions, being able to make somewhat accurate predictions about the future, and come up with a perspective on the past so that conduct in the past fits well with conduct in the present and in the future. Deductive strategies for research differ. If an inductive approach produces a theory or a potential explanation, deductive research starts with the theory. One of the things about a theory, though, is how good is it? How do you know that it does indeed describe or account for the present? So one of the ways in which that happens is that you formulate a hypothesis, that is, a question. And so there may be different ways to try to answer this question, but the upshot may be that you end up getting better understanding or some insight about the validity of the theory. The other thing about a hypothesis is that you may be able to design an experiment around it to test the validity of the hypothesis, and from the results may be able to say that the hypothesis is valid or invalid. So, deductive approach tends to emphasize method, process, that it has a step-by-step quality to it, that there may be ways in which you follow these things and be able to gain additional insight into your theory. Another issue that shows up in research has to do with the distinction between causation and correlation. Causation may be the easier of the two to describe because it's much like a likely simple formula that you've heard, if A, then B, so that a link exists between the two, and you end up finding that the link is so important that, in effect, one causes the other. Correlation also finds a linkage, but it might not be as obvious. And one of the difficulties then is discovering that correlation may reveal something or may hint at something that connects these items in a way that you can't necessarily intuit. You might in fact have to do research to be able to find this out better in the future. To be able to find causation, you need to have time order so that A to B means that there's a sequencing going on. You also need to be able to rule out alternative explanations, that no other factor produces B but for A. Otherwise, your ability to be able to establish that A produces B is called into question. Finally, with causation, you're having a type of correlation, that a linkage exists. So causation is a subset of correlation. It is a particular form of correlation. Yet, sometimes it may be difficult to figure out causality. The example that's used in the book talks about the linkage between poor health and lower income. Does poor health produce lower income? Does that mean that, in effect, because of the health situation, somebody can't earn good income? Or does lower income produce poor health? Because lower income means that an individual may not have money to spend, say, on preventive care, or to be able to pay for medical attention to be able to improve the poor health. Which comes first? In the example, it may not be very obvious necessarily which comes first, and so one of the things that may need to happen is to try to figure out what comes first. When you're going about and trying to figure something out, what you need to do is try to isolate aspects or facets of them. Consider the factor that you are isolating as a variable, a thing. There are ways in which variables have relationships to one another. Consider this one. The independent variable is the variable that you are studying. If you manipulate the independent variable, you hope to see a change in the phenomena. Measuring that change is the dependent variable. So let me go back to the example involving income and health. If, in fact, a change in income improves the quality of the health, the change in income is the independent variable. It is the thing that you are able to manipulate. And the improved health is the dependent variable. It is the measurement. It is the way that you can understand better that something has happened. So you see the linkage between the two, although, however, it can be rather difficult to figure out what's going on. In the process of trying to identify these kinds of variables, you may find that other types exist or apply. You may also find that there's a way in which you're trying to go about testing your hypothesis. Let me stop here for segment 1, and I'll pick up talking about other types of variables in the next segment.